I would like to tell you a rather long story, which began more than 10 years ago. In the beginning, the need was absolutely practical. When I presented the classic CX-8, the floor-standing ones, many people pointed out to me that they were big loudspeakers. Then I came up with the idea of trying to reduce them into 16ths in order to have a more manageable, smaller speaker. I'm not suggesting a mini speaker, but rather something that can be more suitable for everyone's requirements. Naturally, the issue was keeping the performance of the floor-standing CX-8, or at least staying close to it. And so I began to work on that loudspeaker to be able to pull something out of it that could work in a relatively smaller volume. I threw out some furniture, did some testing, I threw out a few speakers, and finally came up with the first prototype. With some characteristics, in short, now I would say barely acceptable, but at least in line with the requirements. Since then, work has then been done on the details, on refining the driver, refining the crossover, in finding the right wiring, finding the right materials. But fundamentally, the heart of the project has remained the same as it was 10 years ago. The history of the CX-8 monitor dates back quite a long time, well before we familiarized with the final case design that we met. Several years ago, there were actually several iterations of the design that were more or less functioning. This one that is to my right is the first pair of cabinets I put together to evaluate the mini or almost mini speaker hypothesis based on the coaxial I was already using for the CX-8. Those in the know may have noticed some slight resemblance to Audio-Technique's small cabinet, if only in the type of speaker mounting and the type of rear loading. It was an attempt, I must say, quite unfortunate. This type of loading did not appeal to me at all, also because the drivers were very different, but I liked the philosophy and had wanted to try it. The idea of that type of load was abandoned fairly soon, and the huge rear hole was abandoned for a slot load, so a more traditional reflex, even if not quite in the common groove. From the twin we see that the internal absorber was still very different from what it has become now. And so in short, the two darlings were put to rest in storage because nothing good had turned up. The second attempt was definitely luckier. Actually, this is the one that was saved from the second attempt. There were some other dead and missing. In the meantime, however, this actually is the final case in the sense that the volume, the type of tuning, the mounting of the speaker are already what later became the CX-8 monitor. Now, clearly, as you can see, the care and assembly and the finish is questionable, to say the least, even the choice of materials for that matter. However, this is a scenario where the measurements were conducted prior to reaching the cabinet that we are familiar with. Looking inside, we can see that the absorbent is already the felt that was later used in the final version. And also the position and size of the tuning tube are those exactly that we see in the made and finished cabinet. This particular cabinet was the pioneer in being designed to cater to third-party listeners. The other cabinets, however, I felt embarrassed about, so I kept them in their original location. On the other hand, these ones here were already of decent quality to be audible, in short, a glimpse into the past and a touch of nostalgia as time was passing by. The subsequent step naturally involved refining all the aspects that eventually shaped the current sound produced by the CX-8 monitors. This included selecting the appropriate materials, finally adjusting the crossovers components, and choosing the optimal wiring. The choice of a decent finish, that is also an important part. These are all steps that lead from prototype, from basement to a finished product, and they are all steps that involve reconsidering all the parameters, redesigning parts, the management of a whole range of issues related to material availability, ease of processing, all issues whenever we engage in playing the prototype game. Well, clearly don't exist, but when we have to move to a finished product, they end up consuming a large portion of the time in terms of the project total. But let's leave the old glories. And let's get closer to the cook's table to see what the ingredients are instead of the final CX-8 monitor model 2022, because it has changed a little bit from the past, not a lot as I told you, but a little something to see is there. So, what do we start with? Let's start with the important part, which is the speaker. The speaker is the BNC8 CX-21 coaxial. To remove all doubt, because over time I have been asked dozens and dozens of times. To address any concerns up front, it is important to note that this speaker has also undergone extensive modifications. These modifications were necessary due to the structural and constructive nature of the original version, which is an object truly beyond good and evil. It does not have the characteristics to be able to give us a sound definable as high fidelity. It is a professional speaker, so sturdy, immortal, you cannot break it with any amplifier known for high fidelity. You break the amplifier first, however, it does not sound poor. It has several problems in the mid-high range in terms of regularity, and in the low range in terms of extension, i.e. the original doesn't go down there. Here, we are helped by our modifications, which are applied to both the low end, i.e. the woofer cone, and the mid-high end, i.e. to the mid-high compression driver. Having said that, I simply allow myself to show you how it is built, how this speaker is made. It is absolutely clear that this is not a hi-fi item where sheet metal and very low weights are the order of the day. We can take a quick look just at the thickness of the polar plates of the woofer's magnetic apparatus to realize that we are dealing with something different. Polar plates that are not molded, they are turned, so they are finished to have as correct a magnetic circuit as possible. Same goes for the mid-high end, but we know this well. One driver is not enough to make a speaker. A whole series of other parts come into play where you need to go and look, refine, check. And one of the most important things, as I have always told you, is the internal wiring of these speakers. Here we have a bunch of cables, and here instead we have the originals, that is our Litz-Cardas coils. You know that the Litz cable consists of a string of conductors, insulated from each other individually by means of an enamel covering. This makes the conducting surface area of these cables n times that of a conventional cable, put together with the excellent copper that Cardas uses for its conductors. And you have a wiring completely different from the usual. I want to point out it is very rare that in objects of this cost level, let's talk about cost level, you find such refined wiring. For what reasons? Well, basically the first, these cables cost an arm and a leg. The second reason is that, as I have already told you, these cables before they are used have to be treated with a tin bath in a crucible at about 450 degrees. Tin that possibly comes in this form, that is in bars of, I would say, half a kilo, but actually they are American sizes, so they will be in ounces, I don't know how many, and it also comes from Cardas because it is their tin, and along with their tin, also their flux paste, which is used to properly clean the copper from the insulating enamel and be able to allow the best and most complete adhesion of the tin, and thus the soldering done properly. Speaking of soldering, This is also done with the tin. That Cardass, this is to comply as much as possible with a philosophy, but more a choice of materials that is consistent and can give the best performance. Although someone will surely object, it is only a few tens of centimeters of cable, because inside our speaker there are a few tens of centimeters of cable for each speaker. In all, roughly speaking, there is about 2.5 meters of cable that starts from the input terminals, even for the terminals. As it happens, I chose Cardass material because of the quality, the durability also, and the precision they have in making these. In their seemingly small and insignificant form, these items carry greater importance when our connector establishes a solid bond. It is not arbitrary that these terminals are included in the case. They are consciously mounted on a small plate of brass. Thus, the bolts remain insulated with Teflon bushings to maintain their insulation. This brass plate, a couple of millimeters thick, was a nice little problem to make, because this plate is mounted flush with the cabinet, and therefore inside a milling that had to be done with some precision, not too thick, not too thin, and above all the right size for this to fit perfectly. Well, I will not tell you the difficulty to be able to have the right proportion between the metal part and the line part of the cabinet. How many times we had to refine and adjust the designs, because the tolerances for Murphy's Law, as you know well, always all go in the same direction and never balance out. Anyway, beyond the sad stories of our plates, a nice 2mm plate screwed in 8 points to the cabinet, I would say provides adequate vibration protection for our connectors, is a triviality though. If you think about it, all these details make their contribution to the final result. I would say that the sound of these speakers is the sum of all these small attentions that, you know, mean time and money in the design phase and in the implementation phase. But they are those negligible details that, even if they are not there, the speaker sounds the same. Yes, it sounds the same, but not in the same way. Since we have been talking about the speaker, let's also talk about the material that is used to seal the edge of the speaker on the cabinet. Instead of using the usual various foams that are thrown in there in pretty much every case, I prefer to use a neoprene foam gasket made of neoprene foam, because it is much more durable and has an ability to adhere to surfaces that are not perfectly, even much better than the others to other foams. And moreover, over time, it retains these characteristics. So even if crushed, it continues to adhere. It does not lose elasticity. This also could clearly have been done without, but you know, I am a troublemaker, and before others get the grit, I plant it on myself. What other ingredients are in the recipe? Well, this is also one of the important ones, Aerognose. This is the synthetic felt I use for the interior insulation of the cabinet. I did not want to use rubbery materials, or in the form of foams, or in the form of whatever you want. I preferred an old-fashioned fibrous material that is rather compact and thin, for two reasons. One, I did not want to interfere with the internal volume. Two, I did not want to introduce excessive leakage on the insulation material. I will never tire of saying that the philosophy of this diffuser is precisely to minimize unnecessary losses at all levels speaker, cabinet, and our absorber also fulfills the task of minimizing unwanted losses. This material manages to be sufficiently dull, is nailed in several places to the wood, so it further dampens its vibrations, but avoids the loss of energy to whatever is radiated inside the speaker, and thus avoids making us lose efficiency unnecessarily. One might add that it is also one of the best sounding absorbers in the history of loudspeakers, but we keep that to ourselves because they are our little secrets. With the last iteration of production of these speakers, one of the hardest materials to come by were precisely the screws and bolts. The problem was to avoid using low-grade materials here as well, and it seems that in Europe it was absolutely impossible to find such screws and bolts of a certain quality. You could only find more things imported from the Far East, that, then after a few days they rust, just to say the least. But above all, they don't have materials that guarantee the seals of a properly done tightening. And so I felt I should also say a word about these very trivial screws. In these anonymous little envelopes, then we have the new feet, which are no longer steel like the old production, but are of very nice profiled brass. These screw directly into the bushings to give a greater coupling of the speaker with the support. I would say that it remained last but absolutely not least our cabinet in the new version, because here indeed there have been the innovations, or at least the tweaks, the most important changes. Let's start as well with the simplest part, i.e. the grid. The dear old grid, more or less phono-transparent. However, as you see, this one is rather transparent. It is no longer fixed with the usual joints, but is fixed with nice little magnets, which on the cabinet side are recessed from the inside by precision milling that brings them to no more than a millimeter from the surface and allow us to properly hold without letting it vibrate or fall. Worse still, our grid that also itself is rather heavy. This is a ready-made cabinet, is practically finished, just waiting for more of its speaker. We see the wiring in leads popping up ready to be soldered, because inside of these speakers you don't use other types of splicing than soldering. You don't use connectors, you don't use fastens or other things like that, also because of the fact that we really want to avoid the losses of crimped connectors or other things like that. Yes, I know you lose a lot of time, you take a lot of time to build them so much. So let me do, these are cables, and they will then be soldered directly the tabs of the speaker. On the inside you can already see the felt cover that is nailed in several places, and you can see the crossover, which is under to the rear crossover cloth, which is originally this and then is modified and covered with damping material for my friend's tar, because good old tar really works very well at dampening the vibrations of capacitors' resistance, but especially the inductors that are already resined, but are resined with a material that is quite stiff. The fact that you use a cover of damping material that is instead quite plastic allows you to improve the broadband damping not only at certain frequencies, and therefore improve, I would say, significantly the performance of the crossover. Back to our cabinet for a moment longer, I'd like to show you the finish of the edge where the speaker is mounted. From the inside, it is countersunk. It is machined from the inside and countersunk to avoid, given the thickness of the front, which in any case is 3 centimeters. So not exactly negligible, to avoid the interaction between the edge of the front and the membrane of the speaker. It is machined from the inside and countersunk, clearly leaving a surplus of material where the mother screws for fixing the speaker itself are placed. I said mother screws for fixing the speaker itself. I know that this is not something you see around, because normally the speaker, unless you are spending the tens of thousands of euros for a speaker, is simply screwed with self-tapping screws into the wood of the cabinet, and this, as an economic solution, can also be absolutely respectable. However, if we want something more, then we use 6mm M6 bolts screwed into their mother screws, which in turn are fixed inside the cabinet. This is because when the screw presses the speaker against the front, the mother screw from the inside is working in traction and therefore will improve even more its tightness, so you don't risk pulling the screws and pulling the mother screws out on the other side. These are working in traction and will never move, because the more you pull them, the more they lock inside the wood. This allows us to use much higher torques for our bolts than normal, and therefore make even more solid the chassis of the speaker, which is quite sturdy, as we know, with the front of the case, which is quite sturdy in turn. I would say that with the construction details we have said what needed to be said. We can move away into the room to see how to use, how to place in the room, and how to connect the speakers properly, or at least as properly as possible. And now let's try to take a look at the CX that is in a room. For listening, What are the characteristics a little bit particular that allow us to run our CX monitors a little bit more casually than other speakers? Then let's remember, we talked about it earlier, the type of loading for the low range and the horn output for the mid-high range. The fact that having a loading for the low range a little bit out of the ordinary allows us, for one thing, to get much closer to the back wall than we could with an ordinary speaker without risking of unnecessarily enhancing the extreme bass, rather reinforcing what is the natural emission of the speaker. In this case, in our listening room, the edge closest to the back wall of the speaker is 25 centimeters and are absolutely reasonable distances. Nothing prohibits us in different environments to move away from the back wall. But the interesting part is that even as we get closer, exaggeratedly to the walls, we do not lose those acoustic scene characteristics that characterize our coaxial high talker, because the emission of our speaker in the mid-high range is narrower than that of a traditional speaker, which does not mean that we have to take aim with a laser to listen to it indeed. However, some attenuation in the lateral emission range allows us to decrease so much what are the reflections on the side walls and the back wall. So even if we are sticking to the walls in short, relatively sticking to the walls, we do not lose the depth of the scene, because the spurious reflections on the back and side walls will naturally be attenuated by what is the speaker's own emission. As for the height from the floor, also here, I can give you some advice. The first advice, the simplest one, the one that is the most basic and most usual, is that the center of emission be at the height of your ears. When I talk about the center of emission, in this case, obviously, I am also talking about the center of the speaker, because that is the center of emission of our system here. In our case, we have the center of emission 1 meter off the ground. This is because the seats that I use in this room are quite high, so the listener's ear comes roughly 1 meter from the ground. What I recommend is to adapt the supports if you have the possibility, or to adapt the seats to the type of support you have, so that you always have the height of the ear at the listening point. Roughly at the height of the center of emission, as far as the direction of the speakers, I usually recommend, under normal conditions, to orient them toward the listening point, not directly. However, say, of orienting them halfway between the position parallel to the back wall and the position directly aimed at the listening point. This, under typical conditions, is the positioning that allows us to have the best balance between the center stage and the three-dimensionality and openness of the virtual soundstage. As for the distance between the speakers, the distance from the listening point, I go back to the classic rule, i.e., same distance between the two speakers than the distance between the listening front and the listening point. So 2.5 meters from one to the other, 2.5 meters distance to the listening point, easy, easy, easy. Of course, in any listening room, these basic rules will want some tweaks, will want some adjustments though. For what is my experience, we usually get it pretty much right the first time. Another fairly recurring question, as it should be after all, concerns what type of amplifier to use for these speakers. Let's summarize again the features that are important. For this aspect, first of all, a fairly high efficiency. Secondly, an ease of driving, definitely remarkable, given the simplicity of the crossover filter that has no equalizations, no strange compensation cells. You get a load impedance. Very easy, that does not impeach any kind of amplifier. And then the timbre, a correct and articulated low range is a high range, always pretty, not that it never gets overly put in need, and above all, absolutely free of distortion. These characteristics actually broaden by leaps and bounds what is the possible plethora of amplification that we can connect to these speakers, for which we can use a good transistor, why not maybe a nice class A of the tradition of sufficiently low power. But I've also tried them with pretty powerful class ABS. We're talking about a couple 100-watt items, but which strangely enough kept a grain sufficiently digestible as far as I'm concerned. And even then we've taken away from it a very, very interesting performance. It's clear that the partners of the actions of these speakers are tube amplifiers, and maybe tube amplifiers of a certain quality, because at that point we can take full advantage of the resolution capability of the speakers, and in addition they allow us to listen to our 5-watt or even less monotriode in a room a little bit smaller in size than an auditorium, because normally we know speakers of a certain efficiency acquire important dimensions here. This speaker here allows us to stay on the delicious low powers without having to remove the cabinets of the room. Indeed, because of this very ease of placement in the room, it can even be literally, as happened to me, thrown on the furniture in the living room without giving too much attention, and moreover it works as it should. Maybe in that case we use some trick to isolate the speaker from the cabinet that supports it, not to vibrate altogether, but in the end acoustically the result is there. So attach them a little to what you want. The concept is this: they really lend themselves very well to take on different roles depending on how they are driven. Obviously, do not recommend these speakers to those who are not of sufficiently refined taste. If you want the speaker that makes the disco in the low range, it's not for you. If you want the speaker that makes you the high range, making you seem to hear who knows what, also this time is not for you. Let's say that they are speakers for grown-up children. Let's put it this way: when you lose certain velveities of youth and appreciate the good things here, we can consider a speaker like this